Hey, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays with Troy. I'm Troy Lambert, mystery writer, editor, super plotterer, the education lead here at Plottr. And I am here today. We're going to do something a little bit different than what we normally do. So normally we focus more on a template, and a lot of times we'll have guest writers come on and talk about how they use templates. Today, what we're going to focus on instead is we're going to talk about developing your characters. And we're going to talk about it using goal, motivation, and conflict, and some other things that I'm going to show you. So that's what we're going to go through today. We're going to dive right into that. And we're going to use the character templates on Plottr. And so I'm going to show you exactly what those look like. And then we're going to talk a little about what conflict, motivation, what goal, motivation, and conflict actually are, and how you can use them to make your characters richer. And then at the end, we're going to talk about how you can use them throughout the book as you're plotting things to make your scenes richer as well. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. So we're going to start with, I'm going to share this screen with you, and this is my sample character. Now, in order to get to this, what I'm going to show you is as I click into this, you're going to see some different things than you might see on your Plottr. You're going to see that I've added an attribute that says emotion or verb. And then what I have done is I've started this character. So we'll go down here and just save this for the moment. And to get this, I've moved into the use template section of the character, and I've selected goal, motivation, and conflict. And as I do that, it will automatically fill in these fields for me to fill out. That has an internal goal, motivation, and conflict, and an external goal, motivation, and conflict. And then the emotion and verb is something that I add, and I'll explain why I do that and how that works here in a moment. But this is how you get to this character template. Is essentially, this is included in Plottr. It's one of the starter templates. But you can modify it by adding or subtracting attributes as you choose. Okay, so we're going to move back to Joe sample. So we're going to put our name up at the top of our character, and then I categorize them, generally speaking. You don't have to. There are main, supporting, and other is the categories you start with. I've also added Antagonist, and I'm going to talk to you about how and why I do that here in a few moments as well. And then you have a short description, and that kind of just appears here as soon as you click in to the character section. You can see that I've got those for all of these different characters down the side here. And then there's a space for notes, and that's usually where you're going to have notes about your character, and you'll see some of those in a moment. And there's some images as well. All these images were created by an AI website. If you've never seen it before, it's called This Person Does Not Exist, and it creates faces randomly. Some of them are crazy. Some of them are pretty good, but that's how I've added these characters. The first thing to remember is that internal conflict and internal motivations and goals are the character's battle within of their own emotions or feelings. So generally, it's something that they can control. So an internal conflict, and we'll look at some examples in a little bit, is this is what your character wants as far as the goal is what your character wants in an emotional or a personal way. They want recognition, they want happiness, they want love, they want personal satisfaction, they want validation, they want something along that line, right? That's what their goal is. And their motivation is what gets them up in the morning and moving towards that goal. It's usually an emotional motivation. It's anger, it's frustration, it's determination, and it's basically something that they can control. And then the internal conflict is what works counter to the motivation. Fear versus bravery, doubt versus faith. In other words, your character wants to have more faith and more trust in the people around them, but they have doubt and mistrust that works against them. And that produces their internal conflict. And often this internal conflict then bleeds over into the external conflict. Now, the external conflict is the character's battle with someone or something outside themselves, things they can't control. When the knight goes up to battle the dragon, he can't control the dragon, and he can't even entirely control the conflict itself, because the dragon has become a factor and the dragon has an influence on those things. It's the same thing with an external goal and external motivation. So here's what I mean. The character wants something that they cannot control. For instance, if their internal goal is recognition, they can't necessarily control the kind of attention, if any, that they get. They can't control the media. They can't control those people showing up. And you see this a lot in like serial killer or crime novels, where the guy who's committing the crime wants to get noticed. So he sends letters to the paper, to the police or whatever, that type of thing, trying to get their attention. But he can't control what that attention is going to look like. So he can't accomplish his external goal. He can take steps towards it, but he can't accomplish it entirely without the help of someone else, without someone else that comes alongside him. It's the same thing in a romance. If my external goal is I have my ideal woman that I want to be with her and I want to be married, if I ask her and she says no, that defeats my external goal. So a lot of that's clear, is that this is something they can't control. Now, their motivation and external motivation is usually something that's provided by someone else. It can come from, for instance, if my internal motivation is that I want recognition and happiness and stuff like that, an external motivation for that can come from peer pressure, from a parent, from a significant other that I'm seeking that recognition and stuff from. I can't control whether or not they actually do what I want them to do. But it is a motivator for me. If I'm playing football, I want to please my coach. I want to run the play effectively because he wants me to run it effectively, because we want to win. So my external motivation can be wanting to win. My internal motivation has to be emotional and determination. Then the external conflict is the battle your character can't control. Them versus the bad guy, a law or rule they can't overcome, a romance they can't achieve without the other person participating in the romance. It can be a social norm. It can be almost any kind of an obstacle. So this works for pretty much any genre, is this goal, motivation, conflict. And then once I've established all of those things, I go back and I look at an emotion or verb that helps define my character. How does this character make the reader feel? Does that grow or change as the story progresses? And this is where I map the character's emotional journey, and that is usually tied to their progress towards both their external and their internal goals. And the two of those things will often line up, and sometimes they will compete, producing even additional conflict. If your character's external goal does not line up with their interior goal, then a lot of times there will be a conflict there, because they want two different things. Or they need one thing, but they want another. And so it goes to that needs versus want conflict that produces such rich characters and rich stories. So let's look at some examples of this that I pretty much just made up. This is our hero, tall, good-looking. He's a mild-mannered computer programmer. He's going to be called upon to go further than he would have imagined to save the world. He's going to draw on his childhood martial arts lessons, which he quit when he was 12, to battle more experienced warriors in an effort to save the world. I know that you've probably seen this movie before. I certainly have. And so this is the kind of thing that we're looking at. Okay, it's a computer programmer. He doesn't have any experience except for as a computer programmer, but he's got to save the world because he knows how to solve the problem and code and solve the problem. At first, he's hapless and confused and conflicted, and he moved towards confidence and competence. Because his internal goal is for his life to have worth and meaning beyond just creating code for someone's flower shop website. He wants to be the hero. He wants not only for his life to have meaning, but for that to be recognized, because he feels this will help him build the life he's looking for. He wants to have a life that's different than the one that he has. But his internal conflict is he lacks a lot of confidence in himself to do these other things. So even though he wants recognition, he kind of wants to save the world, he wants to make a difference, he doesn't have confidence that he can actually do it. So then we move to his external goal, and his goal is to save the world, or at least stop the bad guy in this story, right? And so because that's an external goal, because he can't control that. He can't control the bad guy. And his external motivation is danger and even perhaps fear. The bad guys are doing bad things that endanger others, and that's often a great motivator. The hero can't control it, but he can try, and it's that trying that produces the story and the conflict. The external conflict is our computer programmer versus the bad guys, and who will be victorious. In this case, it would probably be a case of brains versus brawn. Who can he outsmart them, or can they overpower him? And that's kind of what that looks like. Now, the key to remember with this is that unless you have a very minor character who only appears on screen for a brief period of time, all of your characters should have some kind of a motivation and also some kind of a conflict, because that makes even those side characters more interesting to the person who's reading, because they're more involved in the story. The more we get to know and care about the characters, for instance, if we think about Star Trek, okay, when someone comes on in a red shirt and you've never seen them before on any episode before that, generally you know what's going to happen to that person, and it's usually not that sad. Now, if it was one of the main characters that died or was killed on the planet, that would be traumatic for every fan. But because it's a red shirt, you don't know them, you don't care about them as much. The more you can make people care about even your minor characters, the higher the stakes of your novel, or your story, because no one wants them to die. They're like, I know that person, I like that person, I don't want them to get killed. Instead of being a simple prop and a tool in your story, they can mean much more to the reader. It increases your emotional stakes, and it allows them to flourish more as a character. And that just makes your story better. So we're just going to look at this one real quick. We've done it the same thing for our heroine. Our heroine's Jacob Bosch. She's kind of the opposite. She has no sense of humor at all. Jacob is kind of a fun guy. Everything is serious. If you don't think so, you're wrong. She's straight-laced, serious in all business. Her character arc is she moves to be more relaxed and more humorous. Her internal goal is to protect herself and her heart. She's been hurt before. She's not going to let it happen again. So she's got this facade of this big, I'm not going to let any emotion get to me. I'm not going to let anything get to me because I'm protecting myself. Her goal is her motivation is to maintain her status quo, and this story disrupts that, and she wants to make things normal again. And her internal conflict is she realizes her normal was painful and unhealthy and lonely, and she needs to change it. So we'll have some kind of a romance in this particular story. So, and then we look at her external motivations, and those are all related to what other people are doing around her. She wants to rein in Jacob and defeat the bad guys. She needs to save her job. Her boss hates disruption, so if she is a part of it, he's going to fire her. And the bad guys and Jacob are just harshing her groove, and she doesn't like that. So your secondary character also needs to have all of these different things that help you as you approach writing each scene to go, why is this person doing the things that they're doing in this scene? Does it align with their internal motivation, their external motivation? Does it move them towards or away from their goal? And how do they feel about that? What kind of a conflict does that produce as they move towards their goal? Perhaps as Samantha moves towards her internal goal, she becomes conflicted over whether that's what she really wants or not. She becomes conflicted about that normal and her internal motivation, and maybe she changes and grows as a character, and that's an opportunity for growth there, even though technically she's getting closer to her goal of protecting herself. And as people get further away from their goal, then they strive harder. That's where your try-fails come in, and they try harder to get back to those goals. Right? So the further away you get from a goal, that can produce conflict. The closer you get to a goal, that can produce either happy feelings, or it can also produce more conflict. And that conflict can be used to just ramp up the emotion of your story and develop depth to your characters. Because we all know, if we're honest about ourselves and the way we are when we're striving towards a goal, there are always conflicts along the way. And that's what makes us human. What makes us who we are. And you want to make your characters as human and as relatable as possible to people. Now, something people often miss is your antagonist. And here we have our antagonist, Dr. Evil. Our bad guy is also 12. He's an advanced evil 12, though. And this was a picture that came up on this person does not exist. And I was like, that kid is evil, so I have to put him in this story. So he's sinister and cunning, and he's bent on revenge. And he moves toward frustrated, apologetic, and then remorseful as we move through this story. But your antagonist needs to have goals and motivations that are opposite of your main character, although sometimes they will sound the same. His internal goal in this case is to prove that he's smart and capable, just like Jacob's internal goal was to gain recognition because he realized he has accomplished things and he wants people to acknowledge that. And the bad guy wants the exact same thing, except he's taking a different, more evil path towards it. And this is why Jacob is going to stop him, because his internal conflict is he's actually very insecure and even sweet. His bravado is a front. And that's the same thing that we see with Jacob, is that he doesn't have confidence. He's very insecure. And so both our antagonist and protagonist want the same things. They're just moving towards it in different ways. So be sure that when you set up your conflict, your internal, external motivations and conflicts, that sometimes they're the same, but the outcomes should always be different that are opposite. This means when things are going well for your hero, they're generally going bad for the bad guy. When they're going bad for the bad guy, they're generally going good for your character, your main character. And their character arcs are opposite. They're kind of opposite sine wave type things. So to put this in the context, I just pulled out Darth Vader. Okay, we'll use him as an example. You know this one. This is the dude who built the Death Star and put an end to love in Alderaan places. Some would argue from his backstory that he has borderline personality disorder. If you're a Star Wars fan and you go and look this up, you'll actually find a whole psychological treatise behind this. His emotion or verb is fear and loathing, and then eventually we actually kind of pity this guy, right? And his internal goal is to revenge himself against the Jedi. And basically get vengeance for his wife. But his internal motivation is hate, but more importantly, fear, which was it's where hate usually comes from, and that was kind of his fatal flaw. And his internal conflict, he has children and former friends among the Jedi, and he's trying to get them to join him rather than to have to destroy them. So if we think about the Star Wars movies in that context, and we really start to dive down to what does Darth Vader want? Well, he wants to crush the Rebel Alliance, but that's an external goal. If we look at more of his internal goal and get to know him, that's when we start to sympathize even with the bad guy. And basically his external motivation is fear. And this is why the Jedi rejected him. And it's also what allows us as people to empathize with him, because we also experience fear as a motivator at various times. Okay, and his external conflicts, the need of the Empire versus his personal desires. He dies a hero because he actually eliminated both the Jedi and the Sith, thus balancing the Force. If you haven't seen any of the Star Wars movies so far, I'm sorry that I just spoiled them all for you. But so this is just one way to use goal, motivation, and conflict in the creation of your characters. But the big question is, how do you put this into action? Because it's great to have this overall view of your characters. And if this was my character, I would have a lot more depth about them by the time I started writing the story. And I would actually increase that depth as I went along. And as I get to know who the character actually is, then I'll learn myself more about their internal goals and motivations. And I can actually expand on these character traits. And for myself, I can fill out more of what I understand about their internal conflict and motivation. And what that does is it helped me through the writing, and especially the revision process and the rewriting process, to make these characters actually genuine. It's very difficult for a reader when your character acts one way in one scene and then acts completely different in another scene, and their motivations seem all muddled. It's really hard for us to identify with that kind of a character. We know really clearly what they want internally and externally and what they're moving towards. That's what we want. Okay, so, but let's take this over to the timeline, because what we want to do is we want to look at this in action when you're actually writing a scene, because I don't just leave this here in the character section. This is a great place for it, and it's a great place to start, and you can put as much detail in here about your characters as you want to. And as I said, most writers that I know expand that as we go along. But when I'm writing a scene on the timeline, what does that mean? Well, let's say I'm just going to open up this opening image, and we're going to look over here on the left-hand side, and we're going to see that I have a character tagged, Jacob McKnight, who's our hero, right? And this is the opening image of a save the cat type thing, okay? And this is the first beat of the act. It serves as a before snapshot of the main character, and this is just, this applies to several different types of plot templates. It's not exclusive to any particular one. But this description is one thing, but what I want you to look at is the attributes. So what have I added to my scene? Well, I've added my character. So I know whose point of view this scene is told from. It's told from Jacob's point of view. And we're going to have an opening image of his life as it is and as it's normal, right? And then we're going to disrupt that almost right away with the next beat, right? And so in this section, I have goal, motivation, conflict, emotion, and then an author purpose. Now, you don't have to fill out all of these as you're plotting your novel. You can, but this is especially helpful as you're coming back and rewriting, because we can see what is our character's goal in this scene. So he has a large goal, and that's what we put in the character section, right? But he also has small goals that are steps towards achieving that goal, and he has to take those steps. Otherwise, that big goal is not something that's achievable. So what's his goal in this scene? What motivates him to accomplish that goal in a scene? What's his motivation for this scene itself? Not for the overall book, but for this particular scene. What is making him do the things that he's doing as he goes through his actions in this scene? And then what's the conflict in this scene? What stands in the way of that goal? I will tell you that if you come down to the end of a scene that you've written and you're filling these out and you can't find a conflict, you might need to look at whether that scene belongs or whether you need to add a conflict to it. Because many times those are scenes that we've written to tell ourselves something about the story, but it's not something the reader necessarily has to know. And if there's no conflict, especially at least into a hook at the end of your scene, there's no reason for the reader to keep reading. There's no reason for them to go forward. So you've got to give them that conflict and a hook into the next scene. Okay? And then emotion is, what do you want the reader to feel at the end of the scene? And the reason I put it that way is you want the reader to empathize with your main character or whatever character is in this scene. So at the end of the scene, if your character feels despair, you also want your reader to feel discouraged and despair. Now, in our opening image, we may, the answer to what we want the reader to feel at the end of the scene is like, what in the world just happened, right? Why did this happen? This guy's natural world was disrupted. What's going on? Because you want them to turn that next page, right? You want at least that hook that tells them, hey, something big is going on here and you want to know about it. Right? So that may be the emotion you want them to feel at the end of this scene. But for different scenes in your book, there will be different emotions, and they should relate to the character that you've chosen. And the reason I often call this emotion and verb is that also dictates which verbs you use in that chapter. So don't worry about this in the drafting process, but in the rewriting process, I'm going to look at the actual, like even a word cloud of those verbs and see what the emotion is that the verbs I've used in this chapter evoke. And if it's not the right emotion, I'm going to go back and change those verbs so that when the reader gets done with this chapter, they feel exactly what I want them to feel. I mean, obviously this isn't 100% formula. You can't control the readers, but you can use verbs and language to direct them to the outcome of what you want them to feel. Okay, the last thing I fill out here is author purpose. And I go, why does the content of this scene need to be in the book at all? How does it serve either plot or character development? And so this goes a little beyond the goal, motivation, conflict in some ways, but it examines your goal as an author. So if your scene here does not come out with a purpose at the end of it, that you can say, this is why this scene is here and this is why it needs to be in the book, you can look at either, quite honestly, deleting that scene much of the time, or you can look at that scene and say, hey, maybe I need to rearrange this or shorten this or change this. If you got those filler chapters where you're filling in backstory that the reader needs to know, you can make those really tight and just be sure you include hooks in those to keep the reader reading. Okay, so you're looking at how this serves either plot or character development. Okay, now for every one of these, even if as I move to the next one, this one I'm going to tell from Samantha's point of view. I'm going to switch point of view for this one. Now, I haven't filled out all of these attributes, but this is where the theme statement happens, right? And it's usually made by another character. So I'm going to let Samantha state the theme of our novel as I go through this. So my writer purpose immediately is going to be share the theme. Okay, and I'm going to use her goal, motivation, and conflict and her emotion in this particular chapter to state those things and to help the reader at the end feel kind of conflicted, because that's how she's going to feel. She's going to be conflicted about, hey, this thing is happening. I don't want it to happen. I want it to stop, but it's happening anyway. Right? And so we're going to set that up in here using these attributes. And these attributes will then translate all across your different scenes. Now, there's another thing that you can do that's very cool, is you can filter once you have entered something like that, then you can filter by these purposes. So let's say I want to see where people feel conflicted in my thing. Then I go up to the filter section and I filter my timeline, and I see that there's one scene where someone feels conflicted. Now, by the time I get done entering all this into my entire book, there's probably going to be more than one scene where people feel that same way, where that's what I want the reader to feel. But I can see if those are spaced out far enough, because I don't want the reader to feel conflicted a whole bunch of times in a row, because then it impacts the pace and the tone of your overall book. And so you can get that tone, you can look at that tone and study it by actually filtering things in your timeline by these various different tags that you've used. And you can even create different tags for different emotions if you want to do that type of thing, so that it gives you an idea of a way to map out your story. You're mapping out who is talking, whose point of view it's from, what the emotions are, and you can filter by all those different things and look at your timeline in an entirely different way. So that's the end of it, is where it comes out, is in your scenes. In your scenes, where you go to your attributes, you're going to create your goal, motivation, and conflict. You're going to create an emotion, and you're going to put in an author purpose of some sort. But where it starts is over here with your characters, where you develop those overall motivations, the overall goal, the overall conflict, both internal and external, and then you're going to use those as you write your book to move them through their various different journeys. For instance, we're going to move Jacob from hapless, confused, and conflicted towards confidence and competence by the end of the book, and we're going to do that through all the different micro goals that we're going to have in each individual scene. And those all speak to this main goal and this main character arc that we've set up under his character profile. So this is by no means the only way to use goal, motivation, and conflict. Okay, this is, as I always say, whenever I share anything like this is an idea. This is a template that you can take and use in any way that you want to use it. There are a ton of resources out there. about using goal, motivation, and conflict, and internal and external conflict, and how to use those to develop your characters more and make them richer. And there's no way I can cover all of those things in a short little video like this. But I would point you towards those resources. Go out there, find them, learn more about your characters, learn about who they are and what makes them tick, what makes them do the things that they want to do. And then your characters will be richer, your stories will be richer, and translate that into your scene cards. Use that goal, motivation, and conflict everywhere to move your story forward. Anyway, I hope this has been really helpful for anyone, for everyone that's heard this. I hope that you've gotten something out of it, that you've learned something as always. That's our main goal. But thanks everyone for joining us for Thursdays with Troy. And again, I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you had a great time. And we'll see you next week for another episode of Thursdays with Troy.